Ladies and gentlemen, it's Saturday morning. That means those two great guys full of information you don't want to miss. A veteran show for all veterans. Welcome Major Andrew White, retired, and Marine helicopter pilot Chuck Wright.
Hey.
Hoorah! And welcome to another edition of Kilroy's Conversation. Boy, do we have another great show for you. We should start just calling some of these segments big knowledge bombs, because we are dropping knowledge warheads on foreheads.
Warheads on foreheads. I like that.
And it is going to be awesome. Last week, tuned in, we really dived in deep and hard into D-Day invasion, and it was amazing. And as promised, we're continuing on the story of some of the most significant events of the greatest generation. And I'm going to steal a line from a good friend of ours, Jacob Shakey, who refers to a lot of the guys and men and women who served our country during World War II as the men and women who saved the world. And if you think about that, they did. I mean, there is probably no better way to describe them than, they pretty much
saved the world.
And so today's show, we're going to focus heavily on the Battle of Midway.
So we need to talk about the chronology. You're always leaving the chronology.
I know. Well, I'm just going to tease.
Stop jumping ahead.
I'm teasing it up, all right?
We started with D-Day because it was a larger event. But the most significant action, the single most significant battle in the Pacific theater of World War II happened 2 years earlier. In the same week, June 4th to June 7th, was the Battle of Midway. And in a lot of ways, it didn't involve as many people, but it had an equally profound impact on the war. And it was really interesting. And I'm gonna start with a tangent, but it's directly related to this subject. There is actually a book out there, and I'm not going to say the name of it. Because,
do you have first edition in your library?
Nope, I will never buy a copy of this book, because their whole premise is that it would have only taken another year or two for the U.S. to have won the Battle of the Pacific if we'd lost at Midway. And we're gonna provide some visual aids, and I'm gonna come back to this point in our last segment, and we're going to re-show the map, and I'm going to explain why that is absolutely ludicrous. This was the vast majority, particularly of respected historians, recognize this as the tipping point.
At least in the Pacific, no question about it.
Yes.
Yeah, no question about it. Keep in mind, for those who, again, I'm still not 100% sure whether we still teach history or not in the public school systems, or at least World War II. But there were two fronts. There was the European theater and the Pacific theater. Midway was heavily in the Pacific theater. Not only that, but it was, I think, undeniably the turning point of the war. It really showed that while we took a good black eye at the Battle of Pearl Harbor, 6 months later? Five and a half, 6 months later.
6 months later. Almost 6 months to the day, as a matter of fact.
We came back, and it was the Japanese worst nightmare come true, because they said after attacking Pearl Harbor, all we've done is woken up the sleeping giant.
That is exactly correct.
Boy, was they right.
And a lot of not only the attempts to invade the island of Midway, but also the other intention of Admiral Yamamoto. We're going to come to his picture and Admiral Nimitz's picture, because these were two of the greatest naval tacticians ever. But I've thrown the map up here to try to help understand. For one thing, the Pacific is massive. All of Europe could fit in without touching either coast. You can see all the way to the right, and in the center is the island of Hawaii. You can see how close Midway is. And slightly below Midway is the island of Wake, which the Japanese did in fact invade and held. But from Wake, they could not launch land-based bombers. Real easy for me to say. Somebody get me a coffee. And hit Hawaii. They could do that from Midway.
Was it because it's too far away, or was it just the size?
Yeah,
right.
Too far away. And keep in mind, one of the premises of this idiotic book is the Japanese didn't have a plane that would reach, but they certainly had a 4-engine seaplane bomber that would easily reach Hawaii.
Right.
And keep in mind, and we'll get to the facts, the stats, their greatest mistake in bombing Pearl Harbor, purely coincidentally,
yep, all the aircraft carriers.
Aircraft carriers were out at sea.
Which, and keep in mind, all right, up until this point, aircraft or naval aviation aircraft carriers were still very much new. You know, I mean, World War I, were they really even used much other than maybe reconnaissance at best?
Originally, the battleships would launch seaplanes off the back of them.
But that was all that it was. I mean, it was very infant. The battleship was the king of the sea, if you will.
Absolutely.
At that point, battleships were, you know, if you were in the Navy, if you were a captain, if you had a choice of a battleship or an aircraft carrier, you chose a battleship because that was the
premier.
Yeah.
That was the premier. So earlier in the month of May, and I'm trying to remember the exact date, sorry about that, was the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first battle first naval engagement fought where neither side saw the other except from the cockpit of a plane.
Interesting fact.
And this is the difference between a battleship that could hit an enemy, and let's say max range was about 20 miles, probably 12 to 15 to hit somebody accurately, but we'll call it 20 miles. Max range of a carrier, 200 miles, 10 times as far.
Exactly, and huge difference. And that changed the way both sides looked at, while the battleship is still important, the aircraft carrier now becomes the
Japanese had recognized this before we did. In a lot of ways, they were in many ways, they were much more innovative than we were. We had a lot of, battleship admirals and it wouldn't be until after Midway that they woke up and went, oh, yeah, this really works. In fact, Billy Mitchell, who they named the B-25 after,
right,
was actually court-martialed for taking airplanes and using them to sink a battleship. Now, it was a target ship. This was not like one with a full crew or anything, and the intention was to shoot it, but he did it, and it was supposed to be used for gunnery practice. He took 6 or 8 biplanes and sent it to the bottom of the ocean. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, too, because they have found the wreckage, and we're going to get to that as we get into our second segment of this as we continue the discussion. But we're actually going to show some pictures, because that in and of itself, finding those ships, is a very interesting story of itself. But let's
go back to Battle Midway and what's going on here. I mean, keep in mind, we're still licking our wounds from Pearl Harbor. Things aren't going great for us yet. It's still one of those things where, like, man, we need to do something.
The Japanese had still not been defeated.
They have not.
And we can talk a little bit, and it does relate to this. So the Battle of the Coral Sea, we lost which ship?
Wasn't the Hornet?
Wasn't the Yorktown. Wasn't the Hornet. Wasn't the Enterprise. Wow. We're almost at
our segment. You know what? When we come on the next segment, I'm going to find out which ship we lost.
We'll look that up. So we lost one of our carriers. We had 4. We were down to 3.
The Ranger.
That's right. The Ranger. There we go. So the key to this is, although we lost a carrier, and that was a big loss, we damaged several of their what we would call capital ships, their battleships, their cruisers. The biggest advantage we took away from it, Japanese declared it a victory, but we shot down twice as many of their planes as they shot down of ours. This would become even more dramatic in the Battle of Midway, but it was extremely important. So from that standpoint, most historians call the Battle of the Coral Sea a draw. But this was the closest the Japanese had come to being defeated.
I apologize. Correction. It was the Lexington that we lost.
Lady Lex. I should know that.
And the Yorktown was damaged heavily and brought to dry dock.
Was brought to dry dock. It was turned around. It was not damaged as badly as they originally thought. It was turned around in time to join Admiral Nimitz's Enterprise and Hornet at the Battle of Midway. And when we come back into the next segment, we're also going to talk a little bit about one of the best kept secrets of the war that actually wound up creating a significant tactical advantage for us in the Battle of Midway. But as we come back to the map and as we wrap up our last couple of minutes in this segment, I'd also like you to look to the lower portion of the map, pretty much dead center, just north of Australia, the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal. And so in the next segment, or actually in the third segment, we'll talk about how ludicrous this book is. But the island of Midway was considered both by the Japanese and by the Americans to be of high strategic importance.
Incredible
Strategic importance. And you can see how much territory Japan controlled at that point in time.
Yep.
And as we come back, and we'll talk about the Battle of Guadalcanal, because it becomes very important. A lot of times in combat, people don't understand, and be this on a strategic level, which we're talking about here, the entire theater and scope of operations, or on a tactical level, which largely the Battle of Midway is. And we're going to spend most of the time in the next second talking about the tactical consequences. But the strategic consequences of the Battle of Midway, there is no question. If you follow the dominoes, if you will, as they would wind up falling, and if we lose at Midway, it is very likely that Hawaii is rendered largely useless. It would be bombed on a regular basis by the Japanese. It would have blunted our attempts to push out into the Pacific. It would take us a good, it would be mid-1943 before the U.S. military-industrial complex really got cranking, and we really started to crank out the equipment that we needed to win the war, both in Europe and in Asia. And to come back to the comment you made about waking up the sleeping giant, that was something the people in Japan, the strategists, the tacticians, knew was a danger. They had to secure enough of the Pacific under their control, and their hope was actually to sue for peace.
Yep.
And they would have probably, even if they had taken Hawaii, they'd have given back Hawaii, they'd have given back Midway, they'd probably given back Wake, might have even given back Guam down, but probably not. But they'd have given back some of the territories.
It could be. All righty, we're going to take a quick break and come back more on the Battle of Midway. Be right back. Hoorah. All right. Right. So,
yep.
Make sure, you follow us also on Facebook, Spotify, YouTube. Apple,
yeah, we're going to create the Kilroy's Conversation this week.
So,
and that's one ask for everybody who's listening, anybody who's listening and hears this, do us a favor and follow us, Kilroy's Conversation on YouTube. We'll have that created by the time this show is broadcast. But if you click follow, we have to get to 100 followers to trigger whatever we need to trigger with YouTube, that we're legitimate and for real and all that stuff. If you want to call us legitimate, I might call that into question.
Yeah, some people might question that, but you know what? The bottom line is we're having fun.
We're having a good time.
All righty. And we are back here, folks.
Segment 2.
Segment 2 of the Battle of Midway. So we're back to, bring everyone back up to speed where we are. All right. Pearl Harbor 5 months earlier, we got a really bad black eye. America was down, but you know what? We did not have a 10 count. We dusted ourselves back up.
And why didn't we have a 10 count?
We didn't have a 10 count because our aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers. And that proved to be a massive turning point for us. No, that, but...
Massive piece of luck. Too.
Yeah, luck too. But also, while the events of Pearl Harbor were horrific in losses, not only just man and equipment, but the significant, we were able to salvage many of the damaged vessels that go back out there and returned. Reception of the Arizona, the West Virginia, and the Oklahoma were the three that never got back in to the fight. Correct?
Oklahoma didn't. The West Virginia did.
West Virginia did. Oklahoma didn't. So
let's do a quick segue since you mentioned the West Virginia. The only time in U.S. Navy history that the captain of a ship, because the West Virginia made steam, they called it back then, had enough steam to get the engines turning, and he was trying to crank his way as fast as he could. Around Ford Island he went, to the north side of Ford Island, and came back to the south where the channel for Pearl Harbor exists. And the channel is incredibly narrow, and it's maybe half a mile long or so, and it's eerie because I've stood in the hangar deck while we were going out to sea, and you felt like you'd reach out and touch the people because on one side you're actually going past one of the housing developments,
right,
for base housing for Pearl Harbor. And it dawned on him the Japanese planes had stopped attacking him as he started around the northern part of Ford Island, which is the island right in the center of Pearl Harbor. And as he's making way, it's, oh, wait a minute. They're waiting, and they're trying to catch me in the middle of the channel. And if they sink me there,
we're done.
Well, it would have taken a while to raise that. So he aimed on the Barber's Point side of Pearl Harbor. He aimed and ran the West Virginia aground. And that's why I know the West Virginia, it wound up receiving very little damage, unlike the Arizona, unlike the Oklahoma, and would wind up playing a part in the island bombardments when we would try to land troops during the war. So anyway, little sidebar there.
As bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse. We were able to recover, and that's really the point we're getting at, is that while that was a pretty nasty black eye, we were able to see through that black eye and get back.
Two targets they didn't hit, and you alluded to one of them before, and actually you mentioned it before. They did not hit the dry docks.
Yep.
Which allowed us to turn the Yorktown around and be ready it was damaged during the Battle of Coral Sea. They also didn't hit, and they had another flight scheduled, and things had gone so well, they were actually afraid of their own success.
Yep.
And they were like, you know what? We're going to call it a day, but if they hit the fuel tanks, that would have tactically and strategically messed us up a bunch.
It would have, and we were very fortunate, but let's fast forward now to Midway. All right. Do you
want to give away the secret sauce?
No.
Not yet?
Not yet.
Not yet? We'll tease them with that.
We'll tease them. Battle of Midway was, from an intel standpoint, great success, but most importantly, a great diversion. How we figured out where they we used a lot of intelligence to get them. Military deception was huge in this.
We realized the Japanese.
We knew they were listening, and we were listening theirs.
We were practicing their own bit of deception, and you will notice that the red line that shows the area of Japanese expansion goes all the way up to the Aleutian Islands.
Yep.
The Aleutian Islands were attacked for the sole reason of drawing the carriers out and catching them in a trap. They thought we had the Enterprise and the Hornet, when in reality we had the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. And this would become significant. So they were trying to do their trap, but you're going to have to tell them now.
Yep. I'll let you.
We knew they were coming. So the code was called Magic, and we had broken a lot of the Japanese diplomatic codes. So we knew a lot that was going on. In fact, how we confirmed the code they were using was the code for Midway Island and the base at Midway, was we said the water treatment plant
I was going to go there at it, and we were sending supposedly a repair crew to go out there and treat the water treatment for Midway.
And so that confirmed that we knew we were reading the right messages at the right time. And Nimitz turned the tables. And why don't we throw the picture up of Admiral Nimitz? I'm kind of a big fan of Admiral Nimitz. I have been through his family hotel down in Fredericksburg, and another one of our famous tangents. Yep. If you have not been to the Museum of the Pacific War, which is in Fredericksburg, Texas, you are in for a treat. I'm going to give you guys the best weekend getaway with the wife is to go down to Fredericksburg, get down there at least on a Friday, plan to spend all morning Saturday, probably in well past lunchtime, at the Museum of the Pacific War. Then there's all kinds of incredibly good German food. There's all kinds of shops, and the interesting thing is a lot of it was fascinating to me. Great places to see. I love the architecture there. We always stay at the Hangar Hotel, which is a real treat. We have breakfast at the airport diner, and you are literally right on the Gillespie County Airport. Literally,
very cool.
Right, you were staying right on the runway. And people do. They fly in for breakfast. The airport diner is known for that. It's only open Saturday and Sunday mornings. It is a great place. But Admiral Nimitz was absolutely brilliant. But he was up against, and let's show his counterpart, was Admiral Yamamoto.
Which was also, in all respect, much like we talked about with World War, with the Battle D-Day invasion, how Patton and Rommel had mutual respect for each other.
Absolutely.
There was tremendous amount of respect for the upper level naval leadership for Yamamoto and his tactics, his knowledge. I mean, he was a naval god.
Yeah, he was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And these two were playing chess. And one of the reasons we left the map up so long, we're trying to give our viewers an idea of the expanse of the Pacific Ocean.
Yep.
And the Northern Pacific is huge, and kind of outside of Midway, there isn't anything out there to hit the Aleutian Islands. It's all water.
It is, and you go. It's tough to navigate. You all out there, and keep in mind also where Hawaii is. Hawaii is the most isolated place on Earth as far as its distance from anything. I mean, so Midway had so much significance for us to make sure we did not lose Midway, not just from our ability to wage war forward, but also to protect our own interests. Because Midway, like you said, Hawaii could have been lost.
Now, you said Midway and you said Hawaii.
Yep.
Kind of a hint.
Yep.
What is the significance of Midway?
It is halfway between there and Japan. No?
Well,
yes.
That's true.
Yeah.
It is the northernmost Hawaiian island. It is considered part of
the
Hawaiian island.
There's a knowledge bomb I did not know.
Knowledge bomb. And did you know? Probably not in our lifetime. There will be another southernmost Hawaiian island that will slowly grow out of the ocean.
Because as everyone knows, and we're going to tangent a little bit, Hawaii and all of its islands are volcanoes.
Yes.
And that
Several
is how
of them still active.
So that I did know, but I did not know about Midway being. You'll have to explain to me on the break of how Midway is, I guess, geographically attached to Hawaii. But we'll talk about that later.
It's the top of a mountain chain, underwater mountain chain. So that's the answer to that.
Alrighty, I like
it. We're gonna talk about the true hero, the technological advantage. So we had these two brilliant chess masters pitting their fleets of aircraft carriers, the Japanese thinking they doubled up on our strength, not knowing the Yorktown had gotten underway, which is really odd because they had spies on the Hawaiian Islands.
Oh, absolutely.
How they didn't see an aircraft carrier going out to sea. It's like, how do you miss something like that? But they didn't.
Yeah. I can't answer that how they did it. I just know that they went above and beyond to get that ship ready to sail.
Absolutely. So we'll actually go into a lot of the battle itself as we go into the next segment. But I had made the comment about the real true hero. Keep in mind, most of the Japanese airplanes, and certainly the Japanese torpedoes, were superior to ours.
Oh, far superior. In fact, many of our torpedoes lacked the ability. What were they? I can't remember the Mark 8s.
I don't.
Is that what they were called?
I don't remember the number.
I think it was called the Mark 8. Was it torpedo?
But they wouldn't blow up.
Not only they would not blow up, the warheads that they were using barely had enough TNT, I guess is what you put in there, or explosive.
Oh, no, they had plenty of TNT. The fuse itself was...
I thought the TNT was not powerful enough to penetrate the thick armor of the Japanese.
They would not blow up at all. No, they had plenty. I mean, they had plenty of TNT in them.
Right, yeah, they wouldn't ignite. They would hit and bounce off.
That was the problem. Or it was the fuse, and I'm trying to remember the movie where that was one of the things they were trying to do.
It wasn't the Hunt for Red October, was it? Where
no,
they had to go in
no. They had no problem with that there.
I know they went in and jimmied with one so that the, whatchamacallit wouldn't ignite, not ignite, but wouldn't go off in time.
What you're talking about on a torpedo is a torpedo has to go so far. And it actually doesn't have to travel a certain distance. What it is, it's counting the revolutions of its little propeller.
Right.
And that tells it generally how far it's gone. But people say, we set it for 500 feet. Well, that's just telling it how many revolutions do you want out of your torpedo. And they do that so the torpedo doesn't arm in the tube and blow their own selves up.
That would be bad.
That would be very bad. Because when it hits that water pressure, it might trigger. And that's the irony in the movie is that the Russian who was trying to defeat the other Russian said...
Took off the safety.
Take the safeties off. And his partner in crime goes, "You idiot! It's armed in the tube. You've killed us all now." And they blow up. So that is that part of the story. But this becomes very important because we launched a lot of torpedo planes.
We lost a lot of torpedo planes.
We lost a bunch of torpedo. We'll tell that story in just a second. But why don't we use this as a good point for a break, if we can?
Yep.
And then we'll come back.
And talk about the attacks, the bombs, what we did, and the significance of some of the key pilots, like Dick Betts. Yeah. You know, what a hero he was.
What an amazing guy. We're actually, we have a picture. We think it will somewhat simulate not just the challenge that he faced.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that as well, because that's actually a really cool story. And he actually hit 2 carriers.
He did. He's the only man to
do that.
Now the question, I guess, for me is, and we're back over here with more Kilroy Country. And now we're going to talk about the real nit and gritty, the battle itself.
Let's get into the cool stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Because we've teed it up. We've got these 2 naval gods, Nimitz versus Yamamoto. You can't get much more heavyweight title fight than these 2 guys.
Now, remember, let's talk about technology for just a second. These guys were 150 miles apart. Radar was not very sophisticated in those days.
Very infant.
And it was in its infancy, especially seaborne radar. And you literally, how you tracked people is you sent out scout planes, and you sent them out usually in an arc. Right. It depends on how far you're going to go as how wide the arc is. So maybe it was a 30-degree arc as opposed to a 180-degree arc, which would be half a semicircle. You do a 30 to 50-degree arc, and you try to find these guys. And you literally fly those planes until they can't fly anymore. And if a Japanese fighter spots them, or an American fighter, because they were doing the same thing, trying to find each other. Absolutely incredible story, because it was a fighter pilot leaving, tell me his name again.
Dick Betts.
Dick Betts' squadron.
Betts. B-E-B-E-S-T. Best.
Okay. So they're out searching. The entire squadron launched. They sort of thought they might have had a hint where they were, but there was a lot of guessing going into that. And this is really the luck of war. And we were lucky because we didn't know exactly where they were. They didn't know where we were. And that would wind up being one of the biggest strategic advantages. And let's throw up that picture of the Dauntless dive bomber. And so there were really 3 planes that were engaged in this. They had a Dauntless dive bomber. They had our torpedo plane, which slung a torpedo under its belly, flew in real low and slow and tried to drop a torpedo. That wasn't going to blow up anyway. Right. So that was insane. I felt for those guys. And then we had our Wildcat fighters. Now, the Japanese Zero fighter was far superior to the Wildcat. And this was before we had figured out the Thatch weave. There was a Navy pilot, Navy ace named Thatch. Can't remember his first name. But he had realized that instead of trying to go one-on-one with a Zero, you and your wingman would fly basically S patterns crossing over each other, like sine waves that would cross. And what would happen is once a Zero dropped on one of you, didn't matter which, the other one, as you were doing these turns, would take the Zero into the turn, which would line you up perfectly to shoot him down. And once we figured that out, that hadn't happened yet. We wound up, the Wildcat wound up not being as poor a fighter thanks to tactics. Anyway, the dive bombers would come in from very high. They were flying at about 20,000 feet. Now, one of the problems is one of the squadrons had bad, at 20,000 feet, there's no oxygen. And they drop down to 12, 15,000 feet. And Best's squadron's looking, going, what are they doing? Excuse me, I jumped ahead. That was the second day. Mm-hmm. The first day, they found the Kaga. What they did, they were at the limits of their fuel.
Yep. That was Don McCluskey who bombed that one.
You're right. So that was the first time we caught them, but they found the destroyer, and the destroyer guided them in. And quite frankly, a lot of these men knew, even as they started their dive, they weren't going to be able to make it back. They were too low on fuel. And even though once Admiral Nimitz figured that out, against the recommendations, because policy was let them drop in the ocean, he says, I'm going to need all of these planes the next day. And he turned the carriers to try to cut that distance as much as possible. But face it, the carrier's only doing 30 knots. It's not going to make up that much ground. But it did save quite a few pilots. So the first 2 pilots missed. And why don't we throw up the picture of the Japanese ship? And it missed because the Japanese ship realized the carrier, once the destroyer led them right to the carrier, but you can see the carrier is making a radical turn, actually does a huge circle in the ocean, and that picture was taken from one of the gun cameras on one of the ships. I mean, one of the aircraft. So what Best figures out to do is, instead of diving on the carrier, which is what the tactics at the time said, he dove like a hunter shooting a shotgun to where he thought the carrier was going to be. And the carriers don't make turns.
No, they don't turn quickly on a dime.
No. So he was able to plant a 500-pound bomb. It went through the deck and blew up. So one of the things that had happened, there was a lot of confusion because, and the Japanese did, they spotted the Americans well before they got there, but they couldn't react fastly enough. But what they were doing is they were taking the torpedoes off, leaving it on the deck and trying to put, they were taking the land bombs off.
And putting torpedoes.
Trying to put torpedoes on to go find the carriers.
Because they realized that they had fallen into the American trap.
Right.
And that is where... Yep. I believe that was the first day. McCluskey was the one that dropped that first. McCluskey is credited hitting the first carrier, or the flat top.
Yep.
Betts hit the second one, and then he hit the fourth one. I don't remember who hit the third carrier that day.
So Best hit the next day would come back, because we sank 1 on the first day and 3 on the second.
Right.
Or was it 3-1? However, it was 3-1. Excuse me. You're right. It was 3-1. So he also had two 100-pound bombs on his wings.
Right.
And he had not dropped those. What also happened was his wingman came in, followed him down, doing the exact same thing. I want to talk for just a second. I want you to imagine, and we showed the picture just a second ago of what a Dauntless dive bomber looks like. And they literally did, because they had oxygen masks on. They flew with the canopies open, unless it got too cold, because when you're up at altitude, it gets cold. But other than that, they would fly. They would go, especially with the back open, because that's where the machine gun went. And I'm going to come to a story on that. They were just 30 caliber machine guns, unlike the machine guns on the Wildcats, which were 50 caliber. But you start your dive at about 5,000 feet.
Okay. You
turn the plane on its nose. You are diving at an 70 to 80 degree angle.
Which is kind of like...
Pretty much straight down.
Yeah,
it is just short of coming straight down, perpendicular to the carrier. The aircraft gets up to 270 miles an hour plus, which is, and their normal flying speed was probably about 210. So you are going significantly faster than the plane is really built for, although they were built to do this. They were very rugged. They could take a pounding. And you came screaming down, and you let go somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 feet. You had a big lever, like a lever on a tractor, and you yanked back on it. It was not very sophisticated back then. It was all mechanical. And then, as you're screaming at 270 miles an hour towards the ground, and your altimeter's spinning so fast you can't keep up with it, you've got to try to level off and pull out without blacking out.
Now, I got to ask a question as a non-aviator over here. Now, granted, I know you're a rotary, but...
flew fixed wing, too.
You know, all right.
Yeah.
By making, now, 270 miles an hour to our aircraft today is painfully slow.
Yes.
You know, we've got jets that do Mach whatever. Oh. How do you pull up? Because they did not have the hydraulic assist that we have today.
Okay, so you can't see it in this picture. The one thing they do have is they do have these great big speed brakes.
Okay.
And they can deploy them as they've released. They immediately deploy their speed brakes, and you just pull back on the stick, because if you're not careful and you pull back too hard, blacking out's not your concern. Ripping the wings off is your concern.
I would imagine
that much force. Even as sturdy as these aircraft were,
how much G would someone be pulling on something like that? Would you
pull the wings off?
No, when you're in that dive.
Out?
No, in that dive, how many G's are they probably pulling?
8 to 9.
Wow.
So your body felt like it was 8 to 9 times heavier than it was. I mean, the pressure, the noise. They talked about the noise. They couldn't hear. The crews couldn't communicate at that point in time. It was
I would
all
imagine.
faith-based.
Now I mean, your lungs got to be hurting.
Absolutely hurting. You can barely talk. And then you get this poor kid sitting in the back, and he's your radio man, and he's your gunner, and he's flying backwards. And by golly, he's got complete faith in that pilot. Or maybe he doesn't, but I can't imagine that roller coaster ride.
The leveling off, when you finally level off after you, I just can't imagine what that sense of just, whew.
When you finally pull out, the other thing is,
and it wasn't over. They got chased.
Yeah, they got chased. They were still being attacked. But the other thing that it was interesting. I was reading or listening to a special on Midway, and they were talking about the change in temperature. So you are freezing cold up high. Mm-hmm. But as you get through about 5,000 feet, it starts to get hot, and everything starts to condense. Mm-hmm. So you can't see real well. Your scope that you're trying to dive through, it becomes useless.
Yep.
You are literally diving at a fuzzy target out in front of you. And that was going
to be the question. Is like, do they have I mean, again, I've never flown one of those aircraft, so I mean, I would imagine, you have your tube that you're looking through, but is there a heads-up
Nope.
console of any kind?
Not in World War II.
Not
Actually, not even in Vietnam. We didn't even use heads up really in Vietnam.
So now we're getting into the battle. We're trying to wrap things up. JP's letting us know time. We sink the first aircraft carrier. Don McCluskey hits it and blows it up. And I can imagine
the
Japanese
second biggest piece of luck is that with the Japanese's indecision, the decks and the hangar bays are strewn with ordnance.
Yep, and they're done. And,
completely done.
I can't imagine when you think about, and I don't know if I really want to call it ego or just, blinding confidence and faith in your military and your leadership. The look and the expression that Japanese naval forces felt when they saw the first carrier on fire. I mean, at that point, you were like, wait a second, I thought we were...
Japanese had not suffered a major defeat.
And now you lost your first of what would eventually be four.
All four of them.
And, the movie, now I know you're not a big fan of it, but, they really hit how the Japanese viewed the Battle of Midway, the second Battle of Midway, not the one with Peter Fonda, but the one that came out 2 years ago. I know you're not a fan.
It was okay.
But, there are some significant points in that movie where they talk about how you look at the Japanese, they're in just such disbelief that, oh my God, we may lose this.
That, one of the things that I learned in my research is that when the injured Japanese came back, they kept them isolated. The Japanese would not even talk about this defeat. Nobody knew it happened.
Really?
Yeah. They literally, they put them in isolation wards. They didn't let them have access to their family. It was really pretty wild. So we're running out of time, but I quickly want to tell the story of Ensign George Gay, Torpedo Squadron 8. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost every aircraft. Our heaviest losses with our torpedo planes. The torpedoes registered exactly 0 hits. But their contribution to the battle is the Japanese Zeros dropped down from high cover to attack them because they couldn't ignore the threat, and they didn't realize that our torpedoes didn't work. They said that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 would actually explode and do damage. And it is an absolute tribute to the courage of men like that had to know. They're going in and they're seeing everybody else in their squadron getting blown away, and they still did their jobs. And they did. They did, in fact, play a role because they kept the Zeros off the Dauntless dive bombers. And I'll leave it with one story that I thought was absolutely hysterical. One of the kids is a twin-mounted 30 caliber machine gun. One of the 30 caliber machine guns literally broke loose. And so the kid's carrying it a la Arnie Schwarzenegger and stands up in the cockpit and is shooting at a Zero going by and shoots it down, is credited with a kill.
Good for him.
This was confirmed. And I just thought that was the funniest story. I mean, this kid out there just practiced a little Kentucky windage and doing that. So we're going to close this out.
Yep.
We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the balance of the Battle of Midway, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the absurdity of thinking that this wasn't the major turning point in the Battle of the Pacific.
It was unquestionably, and anyone who doesn't know history, you just simply don't know how significant this was.
Yes.
And it turned the war in the Pacific, no question about it. All right, we'll be back with one more segment right after these messages. Hoorah.
Yeah, it was amazing reading some of the reviews of this book and people thinking, oh, this is really great stuff. I'm like, do you just not know the story? Do you just not understand the tactics, especially the strategic tactics?
Hoorah, and we are back to wrap up our discussion on the Battle of Midway and how this was America's great moment, first great moment of the war to retake control of the Pacific, and well, it would ultimately lead to victory in the Pacific.
Yeah, and it is not hyperbole to say that the Japanese, after the Battle of Midway, would never again engage in a successful offensive battle
We crippled them. You got to remember, losing 4 aircraft carriers in a single battle at this point in history and time, or even in today's history and time, losing 4 aircraft carriers is a...
Well, today we have about 13 working aircraft carriers. Back then, the Japanese had 6. And with
4
those 6, they dominated.
Yep.
So 4 really gutted their force. And it also changed their tactics. They were unable to bring the carriers to bear in the Battle of Guadalcanal. But before we get too excited about this, it didn't 100% go our way.
No, we took some losses. We lost some losses. We lost a carrier as well.
Let's throw up the picture of the Yorktown on fire, and then we're gonna do a tangent directly related to this, but we're gonna talk about Paul Allen, the man from Hewlett-Packard,
right,
who used to own the Portland Trail Blazers, and when you're that filthy rich, you can do anything you want,
more or less.
But he has wound up. He's had quite a fascination with maritime history. Oops, other way. Yes, here's the Kaga. Here's what the Kaga looked like. And then go to the next picture of the Yorktown that's on fire. So we sank all 4 of theirs, but they got one of ours. Oh, here's the Yorktown at the bottom of the ocean. And that was what he did, is he paid for some extremely expensive research vessels, and they went and found
where exactly
the
did the Yorktown resting point? How far away from Midway?
It is 250 miles northeast of Midway, whereas the Kaga was west-northwest of Midway, where it was found. But you can see the hangar decks, the elevators in the middle that go down to the hangar decks were in the down position. Their hydraulics had collapsed due to the fires that were on board, and we've actually got a picture of the Yorktown on fire. And one of the reasons I mentioned their torpedo planes is it took its first shot from a Japanese torpedo plane that came in. They were well built, better than ours, and their torpedoes were the best in the world at the time. But to me, it's just absolutely fascinating. You can see at the very bow of the ship, underneath the flight deck, where they've got mounts for 2 5-inch guns that were used as anti-aircraft guns. And then ringing the ship were the Bohr's 40-millimeter anti-aircraft gun. In fact, speaking of the Museum of the Pacific War, they actually have the mounting of one of those from one of the ships in World War II out back. They also have really well done. It looks like a submarine coming up from under the ocean.
Very cool.
The way they've done it. Oh, there we go. So you can see that the Yorktown was on fire. She would begin to list heavily before she went down, but she went down pretty much straight down. The difference between that and the Kaga and the other Japanese aircraft carriers, I believe they've only found 2 of those. The debris field. I was listening to a briefing with the gentleman who was running the ship. So the debris field from the Japanese ships was huge. They were finding.
Was that due to they tried to salvage the ships, or?
No, it's due to the damage that they were under. They were literally blowing up from the inside out, and then breaking apart as they went down. So they didn't come down in a straight line. Whereas the Yorktown was obviously badly hit. But I keep looking back here. Sorry. Not looking at the.
Well, that's all right. And that goes to show, a lot of that due to our tactics, our men. People like Dick Best with what he did. I mean, keep in mind, the only man in history, correct me if I'm wrong, do have not 1, but 2 confirmed hits. If you think about the significance of that, that is monstrous. I mean,
is monstrous. So I'm gonna tangent off here a little second.
Okay.
Can you name the only current U.S. ship that has sunk an enemy combatant in combat?
Current,
as in still on the rolls. And if you get this wrong, you are not allowed to
the
go
USS
far.
Constitution.
That is exactly right. Old Ironsides is the only U.S. ship that has sunk an enemy combatant in combat.
that's still actively engaged. I mean,
so here you can see the Kaga, and the reason that I showed the other picture before is you can see how they didn't have the large conning towers that we did. They had very flat decks on their ship, and it's just a difference in style. I think we've kind of perfected that over time. Let's go to the picture that I labeled Tail of the Tape. So we had mentioned before, here we go, and kind of a visual so you can see how badly the Japanese were hit. But the most significant to me, and at the Battle of Coral Sea, we destroyed, it was the same ratio. We destroyed 2 of their planes for every 1 lost. But it was the same thing here. Only this time, they lost 320 ships. So in the matter of 1 month, they lost, and most of the time when you lose a plane, you're losing a pilot. They lost in basically 30 days, 500 of their best naval aviators. They only had 2,000.
And that is also very significant with the way the war was waged out, and they allude to some of that at the very end of the most recent Midway. Is that gave birth to a tactic the Japanese used, the kamikaze.
Yes.
It very much led to, you know what, we did not have any more experienced pilots to fight a naval aviation war. They had to use pilots that were willing to sacrifice themselves.
Inexperienced. The other problem they had is shortly after the Battle of Midway, we started introducing P-38s, F-4U Corsairs, eventually the F-6F Hellcat, which actually had the best record of any aircraft, although that's really a little misleading because they got involved in things like the Turkey Shoot, where it was almost unfair that the Japanese pilots were so inexperienced. We started cranking out technically more superior fighters.
The Flying Tiger, what aircraft?
That was a P-40.
P-40.
That was what the Army Air Corps was flying, and it could fight with a Zero, but it really couldn't. They had to use ambush tactics, which was not unusual for pilots on both sides to use. But head-to-head,
the Mitsubishi Zero was certainly...
It was a great, nimble fighter. It had 2 major problems. The Japanese didn't care about their people. They did not have self-sealing gas tanks. So if you hit their gas tank, it was blowing up like a torch. It was not well armored. So our pilots had a huge piece of steel immediately behind their seat. If you tried to shoot a pilot down from behind, the odds were slim that you were going to kill the pilot. You actually had to attack. To kill the pilot, you had to attack from the side or from the front, and that's kind of a bit of a crapshoot, as opposed to a crap ton, which was our other word we've coined on the show. So, but this gives you a picture, a graphic of the extent of the losses. Now, they did, in fact, destroy a lot of we were flying some Buffalo Brewsters out of Midway. Some of the most of the land-based planes were destroyed the very first day of the battle. The B-17s went out, tried to attack, and then headed right back to Hickam Field.
Right.
Let's go ahead, and for the last slide, let's go back. We'll close out with a map because we've got about 5 minutes left. And I want to talk about some of the things that happened. So it would be not quite a year later that we would stage the invasion at Guadalcanal. Remember, Guadalcanal is to the right of the city of Darwin in Australia, almost at the bottom in the Solomon Islands. Rabaul, for the longest time, would be the big Japanese base, but it could not hit Australia very well. They wanted to get farther south. They wanted to get closer to Australia to be able to bomb Sydney, and Guadalcanal became the key. If we lose the Battle of Midway, it has been assumed by some, we would have won the war anyway. Well, the problem with that is if we lose Guadalcanal, if we don't take, and the Japanese were within a month when we invaded Guadalcanal,
right,
which, again, does not happen without the Battle of Midway. we likely lose Australia. And the
Very
Japanese
likely.
inroads are a lot farther. We are not able to use, as a fairly protected base, Pearl Harbor, because it is within range of Japanese attacks.
From Midway.
From Midway.
If we had lost.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why they considered Midway to be so strategically important. So if we consider this, now, if they hold that, we don't have a stepping off point. Remember in D-Day, they only had to go 20 miles across the channel. It was 2,500 miles from the west coast of the United States.
The tactics, the situation in the Pacific, far different than the tax situation over in Europe.
Yep.
Totally different type of warfare.
The other thing you have, and if you've studied the battles, especially the island hopping, where we basically hopped all of our way, all the way to Manila, and then to, Guam, Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa, you know how bloody the battles were. So the logic of this really weak book doesn't make a lot of military sense. You give the Japanese, if you do nothing else, but you give them 2 more years to train more pilots, to fortify all of their bases more and more, and they were, if you watch,
potentially build another aircraft carrier.
Well, they already had another one coming. They would have had 3 or 4 more aircraft carriers. Now, we eventually had a lot more carriers than they do. But again, where are they operating from? Where are our forward bases? We've got to go and fight our way 2,500 miles away just to find a base that we can operate out of. Everything, the entire dynamic changes. Now, here's the other thing. If you look all the way to the, as you're looking at it, the left-hand side of the map, they didn't get into India. What would have stopped them from taking India to the west and pushing their expansion further and further out? Because the Chinese armies were severely hampered.
They lacked the equipment, everything. That's why the Japanese rolled over China when they entered.
Pretty much.
There was hardly any resistance.
So to say that Midway was not the tipping point of the Pacific War,
you don't know history.
Given the fact that afterwards Japan was not able to successfully fight another major engagement, offensive engagement. They became completely defensive. Now, there are 2 exceptions to that. One of them, well, really they just tried to reinforce Guadalcanal. So the biggest one was really the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
Yep.
And no carriers of theirs involved because
we took them out.
They didn't have any left. But the other thing was, as you talked about the pilots and the kamikazes, that becomes very important because basically what they did is they turned their Navy. And it was a kamikaze attempt and it was actually well planned and well thought out. They tried to trap the U.S. Navy in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And one of the great stories to come out of this, we'll probably do a show on this sometime in the future. Excellent book, although a little bit too many details. The Last Stand of the Tin Can Soldiers, where a task force of destroyers actually defeated and ran off Japanese battleships. It's absolutely incredible. So we hope you have enjoyed this. We're getting the high sign that we're running up towards the end of all of this. The other thing that I didn't mention, if we lose the Battle of Midway, we probably wind up suing for peace, which means
you talked about that earlier.
We don't kick the Japanese out of all of these places. So as you look at the map, realize that we never fight the Battle of Vietnam. We never fight the Battle of Korea because the Russians roll over all of that. And the Russians may eventually have helped us a little bit, but all you were doing was trading one tyrant for another.
Exactly. Well, that's pretty much wrapping up our show over here today. Again, the Battle of Midway. Make sure you keep on following us and check us out on all of your favorite podcast channels. For Chuck and I, hoorah, hoorah. See you next week.
Outstanding.